Will we ever win this war? Chapter 8 in King George, What Was His Problem? In 1777, Joseph Plum Martin, now 17, decided to rejoin the Continental Army. He agreed to serve until the end of the war. The general opinion of the people was that the war would not continue 3 years longer, Martin said. Don't tell Joseph, but the American Revolution was going to last 6 more years, a long way from victory. Sure, the Americans had won that great Saratoga victory, but the British were still determined to smash this revolution, and they still had thousands of soldiers in the United States. In fact, they had thousands of soldiers in the capital of the United States. In September 1777, while Burgoyne was fighting in New York, the main British army under the command of General William Howe captured the city of Philadelphia. Members of Congress packed very quickly and escaped to York, Pennsylvania. Now the winter of 1777 approached, and George Washington was facing the same old maddening problems: lack of soldiers, lack of food, lack of clothing. The army was now not only starved but naked, said Joseph Plum Martin. The greatest part were not only shirtless and barefoot, but destitute of all other clothing, especially blankets. No, the Americans were nowhere near winning this war. Terrible times at Valley Forge. Washington decided to keep his army close to Philadelphia that winter. He wanted to make sure General Howe didn't make any sudden unexpected moves. So, in December 1777, 11,000 American soldiers marched toward a place called Valley Forge, about 20 miles west of Philadelphia. Some of the men were so exhausted by the march they leaned on their guns and slept standing up. Others were worried about their aching feet. Dr. James Thatcher reported it was not uncommon to track the march of the men over ice and frozen ground by the blood from their naked feet. There wasn't much at Valley Forge, just some bare trees and windy hills covered with frost and dead grass. Since some kind of shelter was needed, Washington ordered the men to build log cabins. 12 soldiers would live in each cabin. The men who knew how to build log cabins finished theirs in 2 days. Then they helped the city boys who had no idea how to build a house out of logs. Washington knew his army was facing a dangerously long, hard winter. Martha Washington, who came to stay at Valley Forge, could see the concern on her husband's face. The general is well, but much worn with fatigue and anxiety. I never knew him to be so anxious as now. Martha and the other women in camp knitted socks and shirts as fast as they could, and the men badly needed the clothing. Some had nothing but ragged summer clothes, and they could be seen dashing from hut to hut wrapped in blankets. When soldiers were on duty, they stood on their hats to keep their bare feet from freezing solid in the snow. When they weren't on duty, they shivered in their cabins, coughing from the smoke from their fires, trying to ignore the hunger pains in their bellies. Dr. Al B. Genswaldo described life at Valley Forge in a few harsh statements. I am sick, fatigue, nasty clothes, nasty cookery, vomit, half my time, smoked out of my senses. The devil's in it. I can't endure it. Why? We were sent here to starve and freeze. Why are we sent here to starve and freeze? The only one who had anything nice to say about Valley Forge was a young soldier named Richard Wheeler. We are very comfortable and living on the fat of the land, wrote Richard to his mother. Richard wasn't quite telling the truth. He just didn't want his mom to worry. And she would have worried had she known that there was so little food at Valley Forge that horses were starving to death and dropping dead in the middle of camp. Men, also starving, were too weak to bury the heavy horses. The carcasses of dead horses are lying in and near the camp, complained Washington. The rotting horse bodies stank up the camp and helped spread disease among the weakened soldiers. An increasingly desperate and angry George Washington watched more than 2,500 soldiers die from cold, hunger, and disease at Valley Forge. He was furious with Congress for not doing more to supply the army, and he knew that if the British chose this moment to attack, his army would be ruined. The good life in Philadelphia. Luckily for the American Revolution, General William Howe preferred to spend the winter indoors. Howe and the other top British officers sat by blazing fires, playing cards and sipping wine. The British had taken over all the finest houses in town, including Ben Franklin's three-story brick mansion. So Ben's daughter Sarah had to find a new place to live. I shall never forget or forgive them for turning me out of house and home in the middle of winter, Sarah wrote to her father. At least they wouldn't be able to steal Ben's books. Your library we sent out of town, well packed in boxes, Sarah added. One of the British officers enjoying the Franklin mansion was a 28-year-old captain named John Andre, a talented artist, musician, and writer. Andre turned a local warehouse into a theater and put on 13 different plays that winter. In his free time, he visited the homes of young American women, entertaining them by playing flute and reciting poetry. Andre was a frequent guest at the Shippen home, where a beautiful and intelligent 17-year-old Peggy Shippen lived with her wealthy family. John and Peggy sat in the living room for hours at a time, chatting and drinking tea, sometimes 15 cups per visit. John took Peggy out to dinners and balls and on sleigh rides. We don't know what they were talking about all this time. We do know that they soon started working together on a plan they hoped would destroy the American Revolution. Remember their names. New hope in the spring. Back in Valley Forge, life was slowly beginning to improve. Spring brought warmer weather, and wagons full of food began rolling into the American camp. Soldiers set up their own little theater and put on plays. George and Martha Washington were always in the audience. George was relaxed by tossing a ball back and forth with his officers. While Washington was a humble man, he was also proud of his strong right arm. I have several times heard him say, said a friend, that he never met a man who could throw to so great a distance as himself. Another welcome sight at Valley Forge was a short, loud German fellow by the name of Frederick von Steuben. Steuben impressed the Americans by telling them he had been a general in Germany. In fact, he had been a pretty low-ranking officer. He was very valuable to Washington, though, because he had years of experience training soldiers. And since most of the American volunteers had come straight from farms or workshops, they didn't know much about what soldiers were supposed to do. Steuben got up at 3 in the morning each day to begin work. He broke the soldiers into small groups, personally showing each group how to work together in battle. The only problem was he didn't speak much English. When soldiers misunderstood Steuben's commands, he often exploded into red-faced fists of shouting and cursing. First he cursed in German, then in French. Finally, he called in his translators. My dear Walker and my dear Duponceau, come and swear for me in English. These fellows won't do what I bid them. The men laughed, and they tried the exercise again and again and again. Joseph Plum Martin, who was one of the many soldiers trained by Steuben that spring, noticed that the men seemed to have a new energy and confidence. They were eager to get out of Valley Forge and win some battles in 1778. Back in action. In June 1778, the British Army marched out of Philadelphia under the command of General Henry Clinton. General Howe had gotten sick of the war and decided to go home. The British had enjoyed the capital city, but now it was time to get back to the business of attacking Americans. On his way out of town, John Andre stole everything he could carry from Ben Franklin's house, including scientific instruments and a large painting of the famous American. Washington was ready for a fight himself, and on a scorching hot day in late June, the Americans attacked Clinton's army in Monmouth, New Jersey. In spite of the high hopes, this was another disappointing day for George Washington. He had made the mistake of putting a general named Charles Lee in charge of leading the attack. Lee was famous for his strange habits, including wearing filthy clothes and bringing his dogs to fancy dinner parties. When the battle began, Lee decided not to follow Washington's plan. Lee considered himself to be much smarter than Washington. Lee attacked for a little while, then ordered the army to retreat. The soldiers stood around wondering what to do next. That's when a furious Washington rode up, and this conversation was heard. Washington: General Lee, what are you about? Lee: Sir? Washington: I desire to know, sir, what is the reason for your disorder and confusion? Lee: The American troops would not stand the British bayonets. Washington: You damned poltroon, coward, you never tried them. It was the only time American officers ever heard George Washington swear, so you know he was pretty mad. While Washington tried to organize his soldiers, the temperature soared to 100 degrees. As they did in many battles, brave women earned the nickname Molly Pitcher by carrying pitchers of water to men on the battlefield. Soldiers needed the water to cool down their blazing cannons and to drink, of course. One of the most famous Molly pitchers was Mary Ludwig Hayes. She dodged bullets at Monmouth to deliver water to her husband's cannon crew. When Mary's husband fainted from the heat, she stepped up to his cannon and started blasting it at the British. Joseph Plum Martin saw the whole thing. A cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs without doing any other damage than carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Like so many American Revolution battles, this one had no clean winner, and by the end of 1778, the Americans were so close to winning the Revolution. General Lee, by the way, was kicked out of the Continental Army for disobeying orders. "Oh, that I were a dog, that I might not call man my brother," he cried. Are you the famous Adams? While John Washington tried to think of a way to win the war, John Adams sailed to France. The French had already begun sending soldiers, clothing, and weapons to the United States, but Congress hoped to get even more from France. Adams' new assignment: join Ben Franklin in Paris and help persuade the French to send more stuff to the Continental Army. John had wanted Abigail to come along, but he was afraid his ship might be captured by the British, so Abigail stayed home. As always, John and Abigail kept in touch through letters. To tell you the truth, John wrote soon after arriving in France, I admire the ladies here. Don't be jealous. They are handsome and very well educated. Unfortunately, the French people quickly ruined John's good mood. They rushed up to him and asked, Are you the famous Adams? They knew all about the great revolutionary leader, Samuel Adams. John had to say, No, that's my cousin. I'm John Adams. The French had never heard of anyone by that name. That was just the start of John's troubles. Adams had decided he could save his country some money by moving in with Ben Franklin, and just like the time they shared a bed in the crowded inn, John and Ben began arguing right away. For one thing, Adams complained Franklin slept too late and spent too much time going to parties. Adams was also annoyed by the constant stream of visitors to their apartment. It seemed like everyone in France wanted to meet Benjamin Franklin. He told Abigail, by far the greater part were women and children, come to have the honor to see great Franklin, and to have the pleasure of telling stories about his simplicity, his bald head, and his scattered straight hairs. The older, wiser Franklin tried to be patient with his roommate. John Adams is always an honest man, often a wise one, Franklin said, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. What Adams didn't realize was that Franklin knew exactly what he was doing. By forming close friendships with important people in Paris, Franklin was able to win favors for the Americans. For example, he succeeded in talking the French into giving a few of their old ships to the new Continental Navy. Franklin made sure that one of the ships went to a captain he admired, a man from Scotland named John Paul Jones. The Adventures of John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones had spent the past few years cruising the waters around Britain, capturing one British ship after another. Jones's favorite targets were British trading ships, which were loaded with valuable goods. After capturing these ships, Jones sailed them to nearby ports, sold the goods, and split the profits with his crew. Basically, he was a pirate. But this was legal in the 1700s. If you were at war with another country, you were allowed to capture any ship flying their flag, and you called yourself a privateer, not a pirate. By 1778, Jones was the most feared captain in the American Navy. Abigail Adams heard so much about this bold fighting style, she expected him to be a fire-breathing giant. She was surprised to meet the short, just over 5 feet, gentle-looking Jones. Abigail commented, I should sooner think of wrapping him up in cotton wool and putting him in my pocket than sending him to contend with cannonballs. The British, of course, felt a bit differently about Jones. They were dying to catch and hang him. And on a warm night in September 1779, with moonlight reflecting off the smooth sea, they got their chance. A British warship named the Serapis spotted an American ship. What ship is that? Called out Richard Pearson, captain of the Serapis. And answer immediately, or I shall be under the necessity of firing into you. The next thing Pearson knew, a cannonball was flying toward his ship. Pearson had run into the Bonhomme Richard, under the command of John Paul Jones. Floating so close that they sometimes crashed together, the two ships battled each other with cannonballs, guns, and grenades. Both crews had to stop fighting every few minutes to put out fires on their wooden ships. Seeing that the Bonhomme Richard was badly damned, Captain Pearson asked John Paul Jones if he was ready to surrender. Jones barked back one of the best lines in American history. "I have not yet begun to fight." The fighting continued for nearly 4 hours, and the Bonhomme Richard was soon blasted so full of holes that British cannonballs sailed in one side of the ship and out the other without hitting anything. Then Jones saw one of his sailors, William Hamilton, doing something amazing. This brave man, on his own accord, seized a lighted match and basket of grenades, Jones said. Hamilton climbed up the mast and started tossing grenades down onto the deck of the British ship. One of these grenades landed in a pile of gunpowder on the Serapis, sparking a massive explosion. "It was awful," reported British officer Francis Hiddart. "Some 20 of our men were fairly blown to pieces. There were other men who were stripped naked with nothing on but the collars of their shirts and wristbands. The British pulled down their flag, the signal for surrender. Jones had won, though his ship was so badly damaged it sank 2 days later, and Jones himself was shaken by his violent victory. A person must have been an eyewitness, he said, to form a just idea of the tremendous scene of carnage, wreck, and ruin that everywhere appeared." Benedict Arnold in love. Now we return to the never-boring Benedict Arnold. Nearly a year after the Battle of Saratoga, Arnold had still not recovered from his wounds. Splinters from his shattered bone often poked into the nerves in his left leg, causing unbearable pain. Clearly, Arnold was not well enough to charge around the battlefield on horseback, so Washington gave him the fairly easy job of protecting Philadelphia. Arnold had not been in town long before he met and fell in love with, guess who? Young Peggy Shippen. Peggy easily accomplished something British guns had not. She made the great general nervous. Arnold wrote, "20 times I have taken up my pen to write to you, and as often has my trembling hand refused to obey the dictates of my heart." Arnold got over his fears, though, and soon he won Peggy's heart. They were married in April 1779. He was 39, she was 19. You might think Benedict Arnold would finally be happy, aside from the pain in his leg, though he was still bitter about seeing Horatio Gates take credit for his victory at Saratoga. Arnold was the kind of guy who always felt people didn't appreciate him enough. Also, Arnold was broke. He had recently borrowed a fortune to buy Peggy a huge house, and he had no hope of paying back the loan. Just a month after his marriage, Benedict Arnold decided to see how much the British would pay him to change sides in the war. Peggy, a loyalist at heart, played a key role in Benedict Arnold's secret plan. She knew that he would need to begin sending messages to the British, so she helped him contact her good friend John Andre. Andre was now an assistant to General Clinton, in a perfect position to help with the plot. In a long series of coded letters written in invisible ink, the three started working out their strategy. Arnold's fiendish plan. In the summer of 1780, Benedict Arnold took over command of West Point, an American fort on the Hudson River in New York. Control of West Point was so important, Washington called it the key to America. It was also the key to Arnold's plan. Here's how it was supposed to work. Arnold and Andre would agree on a time for the British to attack West Point. Arnold would make sure to have his soldiers in all the wrong places, and the British would capture the fort easily. And there was more. George Washington was coming to inspect West Point in September. If the British timed their attack just right, they could grab General Washington too. In exchange, Arnold was to be paid a cool £20,000 and made a general in the British Army. One of the most amazing things about Benedict Arnold's plot is just how close it came to working. Imagine how different our history would be if Washington had been taken to Britain and hanged. Arnold made a critical mistake, though. He insisted on meeting Andre face to face so the two men could work out the last-minute details of their plan. At about 2 a.m. on September 22nd, Andre rowed a small boat to a dark spot on the shore of the Hudson River. Arnold was waiting for him. Andre is captured. Arnold and Andre talked until sunrise. Arnold wrote out plans showing just how the British should attack West Point. Andre put the papers in his boot, got on a horse, and rode south toward New York City, which the British still controlled. There he would meet the General Clinton, and then the British attack could begin. One big problem. The woods north of New York City were a danger. No man's land, an area between British and American territory, filled with gangs of violent bandits. Some gangs were pro-American, some pro-British, but mostly they just liked to steal people's money. As Andre rode through these woods, three men jumped out from behind a tree and grabbed his horse. Andre had a split second to guess which side these guys were on. He guessed wrong. Andre, I'm glad to see you. I am an officer in the British service. Bandit, get down. We are Americans. Struggling to keep his cool, Andre instantly changed his story. He tried to frighten the thieves by saying he was actually an American on urgent business for General Arnold. Gentlemen, you had best let me go, or you will bring yourselves in trouble, for by stopping me, you will detain the general's business. But these guys just wanted to know one thing. Where's your money? Gentlemen, I have none about me, Andre explained. The men pulled Andre off the road and searched him, and Andre really didn't have much money on him, but he did have some very strange papers stuffed in his boot. The thieves started reading the papers. And Arnold escapes. Back at West Point, Arnold was eating breakfast at his headquarters when a messenger dashed in and handed over an urgent note. Arnold tore it open and read. A British spy was captured with maps of West Point in his boot. Arnold leapt up from the table, ran upstairs as fast as his bad leg would carry him, and told Peggy the terrible news. She was in bed with their newborn son, Edward. Then he hobbled outside, raced his horse down to the river, hopped on a boat, and started rowing south. That was the last time anyone saw Benedict Arnold in an American uniform. At that very moment, George Washington and his staff were approaching Arnold's headquarters. The men were all looking forward to seeing the famously beautiful Peggy. You young men are all in love with Mrs. Arnold, Washington teased his officers. But as the boat approached Arnold's house, it started to seem like something wasn't right. Arnold should have fired a few cannons as a salute to the commander-in-chief, but the cannons were silent. The incorrectness of his conduct when he knew I was to be there struck me very forcibly, Washington later said, but I had not the least idea of the real cause. Just minutes later, he learned the real cause. As Washington was sitting down to lunch in Arnold's house, another messenger ran in and handed over the papers found in John Andre's boot. They were maps and plans for attacking West Point, all to Benedict Arnold's handwriting. Washington sat quietly for a moment, holding the papers and shaking hands. He finally looked up at General Henry Knox and said, Arnold has betrayed me. Whom can we trust now? Washington soon shook off the shock and went to work. He got the soldiers at West Point ready for a British attack, though none came. Then he put John Andre on trial, found him guilty of being a spy, and hanged him. Washington would much rather have hanged Arnold, but Arnold was beyond his reach, safe in British headquarters in New York City. Peggy, meanwhile, managed to save her skin with a brilliant bit of acting. When Washington came to her room, Peggy threw a hysterical fit, shouting over and over, That is not General Washington! That is the man who is going to kill my child! She was so shocked by her husband's treason, it seemed, that she had lost her senses. Washington was convinced that she had nothing to do with the plot. Peggy later joined her husband in New York. No end in sight. Once again, Washington had just barely escaped disaster, and while that was something to be grateful for, the entire country was getting sick and tired of this war. The American Revolution entered its 7th year in 1781, with no end in sight. The government didn't have enough money left to pay its soldiers. One day in February, Washington was walking up the stairs at his headquarters. Halfway up the staircase, he met his 20-year-old assistant, Alexander Hamilton, who was coming down. Washington told Hamilton he needed help right away with some important papers. I answered that I would wait on him immediately, Hamilton later said. Washington went to his office and sat down. He waited. No Hamilton. Washington stepped out into the hall and started pacing back and forth above the staircase. His impatience turned to anger, and his anger bubbled toward the boiling point. Finally, he spotted Hamilton at the bottom of the stairs. Washington. Colonel Hamilton, you have kept me waiting at the head of the stairs these 10 minutes. I must tell you, sir, you treat me with disrespect. Hamilton, I am not conscious of it, sir, but since you thought it necessary to tell me so, we part. And the young man turned and walked away. Less than an hour later, Washington sent an apology to Hamilton, blaming his outburst on a moment of passion. Hamilton accepted the apology and came back to work. But it was clear that the never-ending stress was starting to affect George Washington, and everyone else too. Joseph Plum Martin spoke for the entire United States when he said, I saw no likelihood that the war would ever